Welcome back to the Illumination Lectures. And today I'm going to talk about King Arthur. And while that may seem like a bit of a diversion from the rest of these lectures, it's not quite as off-topic as you might think. So who was King Arthur and his 12 Knights of the Round Table? Well, we don't really know, because he is simply not there in the historical record. Archaeologists have looked all over the country, various sites have been excavated, and there is no evidence for a King Arthur in the historical record. And this is the same problem that we've explored with the King Jesus story, where he's missing from the historical record, and King Solomon, as we'll look in a later lecture, who's also missing from the historical record. And the solution, as I've found with most of these characters, is either they are fictional, which is what many people say, or we're looking in the wrong location or the wrong era. And with King Arthur, I think it is both of these. We are looking in the wrong location and we're looking in the wrong era. And this lecture, it comes from my Grail Cipher book. And this is another of these comprehensive 600-page inquiries into legendary history. This has all of the information in it. And surprisingly enough, the conclusion is that King Arthur was a real historical character. Although we may need to look very deeply and very laterally in order to find him. And there is also some information in this lecture from my Jesus King of Edessa book, which we've looked at before. And we'll see why this is important in this research in just a minute. So, what does conventional history have to say about King Arthur? Well, many people think they know what the King Arthur story is all about, but very often they do not. And even I was very surprised at how different the real story is to the sort of semi-fictional mythology that we're given via films, books, and even research papers. Many people assume that there is a verifiable Arthurian history, when actually there is not. So let's start at the beginning. The first chronicler that we might use to investigate the history of King Arthur is Gildas, who wrote the Ruin and Conquest of Britain in the 5th or 6th centuries AD. So Gildas was writing his chronicle during the era, or slightly just after, the era of King Arthur. But Gildas does not mention King Arthur. Not at all. He mentions the fall of Roman Britain, the Saxon invasions, the Battle of Baden, which is presumed to be something to do with Arthur, but he doesn't mention any Arthur whatsoever. Which is interesting, because Gildas lived at this very time. Arthur is supposed to be a very famous monarch of this era, and Gildas doesn't mention him. And then we come to the Venerable Bede, who wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English, which is in about the 8th century. So we're talking maybe a couple of centuries after the era of King Arthur. And Bede does not mention King Arthur at all. He mentions, again, the fall of Roman Britain, the Saxon invasions, but there is no Arthur. And people will say to me, you're wrong. They do mention Arthur. So I simply say, well, give me a reference. Go and find this reference to Arthur. And they go off, and then there is a long silence, because they have presumed they know this story, but they don't. And then they cannot find Arthur in these ancient histories. So we're off to a bad start here, really, aren't we? We cannot find King Arthur in these early histories. And then we come to Nennius, who wrote the history of the Britons in about the 9th century. And again, Nennius, they're virtually all copying from each other. So he mentions the fall of Rome and Britain, the Saxon invasions, but again, there is no King Arthur. Now, there is a warrior Arthur in this story, but there is no King Arthur. There's no royal court, there's no Camelot, there's no table, there's no knights, there's no Guinevere, there's nothing that we know to be Arthurian history. And then the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles and the Welsh Annals are very much the same. They mention this warrior who might have been called Arthur, but there is no Arthurian story there. And then we move on. We come into the 12th century. So we're talking about 1125, 1130. And we have William of Malmesbury, who wrote the Chronicle of the English Kings, and Henry Huntingdon, who wrote the History of the English. Very comprehensive, very readable histories of England and Britain, a lot of detail in there, very good histories, but they don't mention the Arthurian story. They mention a warrior Arthur, again, but there is no King Arthur. There's no court, no Camelot, no Round Table, no knights, no Guinevere, nothing that we know to be real Arthurian history. Which is odd. We now have a long, long period with no mention of King Arthur. And then finally, we get to Walter of Oxford and Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote the Chronicle of the Kings and the History of the Kings of Britain in about 1135 AD. And they're writing the same story because, as they say in their own text, they got this history from a manuscript that came from Brittany or from Normandy, and they copied it, and from that they made their various chronicles. And they're virtually the same. You probably won't have heard of Walter of Oxford, but he wrote exactly the same story as Geoffrey of Monmouth. The only difference between the two is that Walter of Oxford wrote a sort of prosaic history, whereas Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a sort of dramatic story. And Geoffrey of Monmouth became more popular because it was more readable. But to be honest, I think the story given by Walter of Oxford is actually much more interesting because it's more historical. And anyway, within these two chronicles, we get almost the full Arthurian story. Okay, there's no Round Table, there's no Lancelot, but apart from that, it's nearly the entire Arthurian history suddenly arrives in about 1135, 600 years after the era of King Arthur. So why is this huge, great lacuna, this huge, great gap, where nobody knows about King Arthur, and then suddenly these two authors, Oxford and Monmouth, suddenly know the whole story, and they got the whole story from Brittany or from Normandy? Why that strange provenance of this story? Why didn't the story come from Britain? Why was it missing from Britain for 600 years? There is something wrong with Arthurian legend as it's presented to us. And then we get to William of Newburgh. And he wrote his History of the English Affairs in about 1160. So we're only talking about 30 years, 25 years after Monmouth and Oxford. And Newburgh ridicules the story of King Arthur. He tears it to shreds. He says, and I quote, "No one but a person ignorant of ancient history can for a moment doubt how impertinently and impudently Monmouth falsifies in every respect. Whatever Geoffrey has written is a fiction invented either by himself or by others, and promulgated either through an unchecked propensity to falsehood or a desire to please the Britons." Yeah, so Newburgh doesn't believe in the King Arthur story. And this is only 30 years after Monmouth penned his famous chronicle. And he goes on. He says, "For how would the elder historians, who were ever anxious to omit nothing remarkable, and even recorded trivial circumstances, pass by unnoticed so incomparable a man and such surpassing deeds? How could they, I repeat, by their silence, suppress King Arthur, a British monarch who was superior to Alexander the Great?" How very true. Just a few decades after Monmouth and Oxford, and already historians knew that the King Arthur story was false, it was mythological, it was fictional, because it made no sense. King Arthur was supposed to be battling with Romans, according to Monmouth and Oxford, but no Romans existed in the 6th century, in 6th century Britain. And King Arthur was famous with many miraculous almost deeds, but nobody ever mentioned him for 600 years. As Newborough said, none of this makes any sense. And modern archaeology says very much the same. Arthur cannot be found in the historical record. There is no archaeological evidence for a historical Arthur. He is, therefore, fictional, mythological. The closest we come to an Arthur is Emperor Constantine III and his son Constans the monk. Now, you might not have heard of this Constantine. I don't know why. He's not really taught very much in British history. This is not the famous Constantine the Great. This is a slightly later emperor from, say, 407 to 411 AD. And Constantine III was a British usurper emperor of Rome. And here he is. He has gold coins. And he gathered an army in Britain and later in Gaul, and he marched upon Spain initially and then marched upon Rome and became a usurper emperor of Rome. He did indeed lead an expedition against Rome, which is very much what Oxford and Monmouth say about King Arthur. So there are many similarities, you might say, between Geoffrey of Monmouth's account of Arthur and Constantine III. So there is a possibility that Constantine III could be an Arthurian character. And Arthurian legend is closely linked to Constantine III because Geoffrey of Monmouth says that King Arthur was a grandson of Constantine III, of this very emperor. And that Constans the monk, because he names him as being a monk as well, the same as classical history does, Constans the monk was King Arthur's uncle. So the genealogy of King Arthur has been hung upon real history. It's semi-mythological, but it's semi-historical as well because it's been attached onto the historical record. Yet, the resulting history that Monmouth gives of King Arthur does not suit the later 5th century at all. It would be far easier if Monmouth had just said that Arthur was Constantine III, because that would sort of make a great deal of sense. But he doesn't. He places King Arthur in a later era where it does not make any sense at all. Furthermore, subsequent manuscripts completely undermine this convenient solution to the missing King Arthur. So King Arthur cannot be Constantine III because of these later manuscripts, and we'll look at these later manuscripts in just a minute. And so we're effectively back to square one with King Arthur being mythological. So what are we to do? Do we simply accept that King Arthur was mythological? But why in that case was the story supported by so many people? Why is it so tenacious within the historical record of Britain? The only alternative is we go back to my original suggestion that we are perhaps looking in the wrong era or the wrong location to find the real King Arthur. So who was the real King Arthur? The clue lies in the later manuscripts because they are not exactly as advertised in the popular media, nor in academic research. You tend to think you know the Arthurian story, but you do not, because you've not been given all of the contentious information that is out there about the King Arthur story. And this has almost been deliberate because they're withholding very useful information that will give you a different perspective on Arthurian history. So let's look at some of those early manuscripts. And the first of these is High History, or as it's properly known, the High History of the Holy Grail. And this is a very early manuscript. It's not very long after Monmouth and Oxford and their more famous Arthurian story. But High History goes off message from the very start because the story does not take place in Britain. There are no battles with Saxons and Picts or Romans. And King Arthur is said to be the most evil of all kings. Yeah, you can see how different this particular history is. And the chronology is all over the place. For instance, Percival, who I say is Galahad, we'll go through that in a minute, but Percival is the nephew or the son of Joseph of Arimathea. Okay, think about that one for a minute. And Joseph of Arimathea was a Roman soldier. And we'll come back to that again in a minute because there is more information on that. And King Pelles, who's one of the very famous kings from Arthurian history, he owned the donkey that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. And it was given to him by Pontius Pilate. And King Pelles was the father or the uncle of King Arthur. Okay, so hold on a minute here. Perhaps you can see the chronological dislocation that this gives us. And we'll again come back to that in a minute. There's more information to come because time after time within this particular manuscript, we get allusions to this chronicle being written by Joseph of Arimathea, or perhaps by Josephus Flavius. Perhaps viewers can sort of see why, having finished my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, I wanted to research some of Arthurian legend because there are so many links and similarities between the two. And these assertions, these odd assertions in chronology and authorship, have caused some consternation amongst eminent Arthurian authors. Because how can this be? How could Arthurian history be written by Josephus Flavius? Or even Josephus of Arimathea, come to that. And William Nietzsche, who is, you might say, the father of Arthurian research, he says of this, and the role of Josephus is of greater importance in this work than that of Joseph of Arimathea. It is Josephus to whom we owe the tale, and he is known as the good scribe and the good hermit. Twice in the texts, he is called simply Joseph, and twice he is called Josephus. It is now generally supposed that the confusion of these two Josephs, Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian, gave rise to the mention here of Joseph and his son Josephus, as mentioned above. So this paragraph sort of needs further analysis, more analysis than Nietzsche actually gave it. Firstly, Nietzsche will not admit that Joseph of Arimathea is Josephus Flavius, although later manuscripts confirm this, and also I've confirmed this from my own research, as we'll see in a minute. And secondly, Nietzsche ignores the fact that both of these potential authors of Arthurian legend lived in first century Judea. So how could they be writing about 5th or 6th century Britain? Ernest Brugger takes on this challenge. He's another of these early Arthurian historians. And he tries to refute the allusion to Josephus Flavius being the author of Arthurian history. And he says, because even if Josephus Flavius was very well known as a historian, and even much respected and held as a Christian historian, it remains striking that he could record events from Britannic history that occurred many centuries after his death. I think these oddities are only the result of a confusion. So Brugger is saying that this cannot be true because he cannot believe it is true, which is not much of a refutation if you think about it. There are many other explanations, possible explanations for this apparent confusion. And this is the central problem with Arthurian legend. It does not seem to make sense. The public and many historians see Arthurian history as being Geoffrey of Monmouth, and that's pretty much all they look at. But it is not. Many other manuscripts are out there which give a different view of Arthurian history. The Vulgate cycle, for instance, is 9 volumes and 5,000 pages, and researchers often ignore this. Guy Halsall, for instance, he wrote very recently, in fact, he wrote a history of King Arthur, and here's his book, without ever mentioning the Vulgate cycle. And that's like writing a history of Christianity without ever mentioning the Gospels. So we're being let down very badly by academia who are not giving us all of the available information. So the puzzling and problematic question that is posed by high history is, how can this 6th century British history be linked to 1st century Judea? Why are they talking about Pontius Pilate and Joseph of Arimathea as being central Arthurian characters? And it's not as if high history is a single road manuscript, because many of these alternative manuscripts say similar things. Take Parsifal, for instance, which is by Wolfram von Eschenbach. It's a classical history of King Arthur, well respected, well written, a good history of this story. And Parsifal starts Arthurian history just where you think it might start, in Babylon. Yes, in Mesopotamia. So Gamuret, who is the father of Percival, is the seneschal, or the knight of King Barus. But hold on a minute. Why are we in Mesopotamia? And who is King Barus? Where have we heard that name before? Who was a king of Babylon called Barus? Well, if you've watched my lecture or read my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, you will probably understand this straight away, because yes, King Agabbarus was the king of Edessa. And so this is probably what Wolfram von Eschenbach was talking about. The king of Mesopotamia, who was called Barus, was King Agabbarus of Edessa. And his son was Percival, one of the central characters within Arthurian history. Again, viewers might see why I might have wanted to research Arthurian history, because Percival was the son of a knight of King Agabbarus of Edessa. So once again, we're back in the 1st century, in 1st century Near East, and talking about Edessa again. And here's another one. This is Merlin Grail, and this is a delightful summary of the Vulgate cycle, because, as I said, the Vulgate cycle is 5,000 pages of turgid prose, whereas Merlin Grail is about 140 pages of lively adventure, and it's a good summary of what it says within the Vulgate cycle. So don't bother reading the Vulgate cycle. A, it's very expensive. B, you'll never finish it. Try Merlin Grail instead, because it's very easy to read, very engaging, and it has a lot of interesting information in it. But it does contain secrets. And one of those secrets is that Joseph of Arimathea was a knight who worked for Vespasian for 7 years. We've already touched on this just a minute ago. This is known as what I call the chronological chasm. And we've seen this before in several of my works. So Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus down from the cross in about AD 30. But now we see that he worked for Vespasian in AD 70. This is the chronological chasm of 40 years. And what Merlin Grail does is, rather laughably actually, Joseph of Arimathea was captured after the crucifixion of Jesus, and he's thrown into prison. And he goes to sleep for 3 days, but wakes up 40 years later and thinks only 3 days have passed. So now he is in AD 70. So now he can be both at the crucifixion in AD 30 and he can be working for Emperor Vespasian in AD 70. This is the chronological chasm. And I've written quite a lot about this because it explains the whole of biblical history. Biblical history cannot be found in the AD 30s, but it can be found in the AD 70s. Okay, but never mind the chronology here. This is also a Christian heresy. How can the saintly Joseph of Arimathea be working for Emperor Vespasian? So who was Joseph of Arimathea? He's another of these famous characters who's evaded the historical record. Let's think about this. He was a Jewish knight, a soldier, who worked for Vespasian. He was called the good scribe and the good knight and a witness to scripture. So who was the famous witness to scripture within the first century? Who wrote all about these things? Who was the good scribe? Yes, it was Josephus Flavius. Thus Merlin Grail is saying that Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Flavius, which is what I've already deducted from biblical history and written about several times before, that Joseph of Arimathea was actually Joseph bar Matthias. But this is sort of opening a can of worms because, as I said before, this is a complete biblical heresy. Josephus Flavius was born in AD 37. So if he is Joseph of Arimathea, the crucifixion must have been in the AD 60s or later, because Josephus Flavius would need to be at least, call it 25, 30 years old to have the authority to take someone down from the cross, which strongly implies that the crucifixion was in AD 70 after the Jewish revolt, which is, of course, exactly what Josephus Flavius says and what I've written about in my books, that Josephus Flavius says that the crucifixion took place in AD 70. It was the crucifixion of the leaders of the Jewish revolt. So I actually said this back in 1997 in my Jesus Last of the Pharaohs, and then I proved it again in 2008, I think it was, in my book King Jesus. And this is central to the story. You cannot understand biblical history unless you realize that most of the events took place during the Jewish revolt. So having said this many years ago, many years ago now, I now find that Arthurian legend is saying exactly the same thing. And it's wonderful when new evidence, unknown evidence, suddenly confirms your original theory. And this sort of confirmation would not happen if the original assertion was false. You only get these multiple pieces of evidence all pointing towards the same result if the original assertion was true. And so it seems highly likely, and more authors are now saying the same sort of thing. It's highly likely that the gospel events happened in the AD 60s and AD 70, not in the AD 30s. And that is what Arthurian history is telling us. And now we come to the Vulgate cycle, which, as I said, is a vast corpus of Arthurian history, 10 volumes and about 5,000 pages of turgid text, which is very, very difficult to get through. And it's a compendium of information and histories from many eras. I mean, all to do with Arthurian history, but the information it gives is actually taken from different eras on occasions. So we get these peculiar asides in the Vulgate cycle, things like the secret history of Pompey the Great. Yes, this is Pompey, the consul of Rome in the 50s BC. The Vulgate cycle gives us the history of Pompey, how he became the admiral of the Mediterranean, and how he fought the Mediterranean pirates in the 1st century BC, which is all true in the historical record from what we know of Roman history. And then it goes on to say how Pompey brought the religion of Mithraism to Rome. And interestingly, it says that Mithraism was actually derived from Mithridates VI of Pontus, who was the adversary of Pompey in the Pontic Wars. So Mithraism was not derived from Mithras in Persia, as is often said. It was actually derived from Mithridates Mithridates VI, and his secret initiatory rites in Anatolia, eastern Anatolia, which is an interesting alternative to what we think we know of the history of Mithras. And it also gives a history of the floating islands of the Mediterranean, much the same as Greek mythology does. And I go through the reasons why I think these were pumice islands derived from the eruption of Santorini in 1620 BC. And yes, this is still all Arthurian legend. It's amazing where Arthurian legend takes us. But what we have is various Arthurian characters will go off on these magical and mythological expeditions, normally on some magical boat, and they arrive in these new locations and find these interesting events, many of which are based upon real history. And so from this we can gather some confidence that what the Vulgate cycle is telling us is actually based on history. If these strange asides can be found to be a part of real history, then perhaps the information it gives us about King Arthur was also somehow based upon real history. Anyway, I investigate the Vulgate cycle at some length, and it contains some really interesting details that are well worth reading, but it's far too complex and far too long to go through in a short video. So I can only refer readers back to the Grail cipher to have a look at the information there. But the other point that it makes at the same time is the international nature of Arthurian legend. Because Arthurian manuscripts were produced in Gaul, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Scandinavia, and in Holland. In fact, the one place we don't find many manuscripts are Britain. So here are a few of the manuscripts that we find in Germany. And these are the Dutch ones. And here are a few from Italy. And these are not simply copies of Monmouth and Oxford. These are manuscripts that are rewritten and reset into the local region. So in Roman de Fergus, for instance, which is the Scottish version, the tale is obviously set in Scotland, and Percival is now being called Fergus. And in Florent and Florette, King Arthur is this is the Italian version. King Arthur is now the king of Sicily, and he's eventually buried in Mount Etna. And the only region that did not produce any manuscripts was actually Britain. Now, you might say that's not true because Monmouth and Oxford produced their manuscript, but they overtly say that their manuscript was Norman Breton. They actually brought it from abroad and copied it and produced it in Britain. So it's not really until we get to Morte d'Arthur by Malory, which was very late, that we get a British version of the King Arthur story. As Malory says in his preface, "For in all places, Christian and heathen, Arthur is reputed. He is more spoken of beyond the sea, more books made of his noble acts than there be in England, as well as in Dutch, Italian, Spanish, and Greekish, as in French." So the King Arthur story is pan-European. As we've already seen, a lot of what it mentions is Near Eastern. It's talking about Joseph of Arimathea. It's talking about events in Syria. And the resulting books are pan-European. They're not really actually British. You might think they're British, but they're not. The majority of these books were produced, these manuscripts were actually produced across Europe. And the same can be said for Arthurian artworks too. So here's a question for viewers. Where do you think the earliest sculpture of King Arthur is to be found? Let's think about that. An ancient sculpture of King Arthur. Would that be from Glastonbury, perhaps? Tintagel? Camalodunum? Well, the answer is obvious, really, if you think about it. The earliest sculpture of King Arthur is on the doorway of Modena Cathedral in Italy. And here it is. And it's quite early. This is 12th, 13th century. And so it's sculpted for that era. So you can see all of the Arthurian knights here are in Norman armour, because that's what they would have worn in this era. And their names are written above. I'm not sure if you can see them there, but all of the names of the characters are written above. So this is the first sculpture of Arthurian history, and it's in Italy. And it's in some detail, actually. Here is Queen Guinevere, locked in a tower, as you might expect. So she is Guinevere Magdalene. She is Guinevere of the Tower. She is the Mary Magdalene character. But here she's called Wenlogy. But obviously, you can hear that Wenlogy was based upon the name Guinevere. It's the same name with a slightly different pronunciation. And here is King Arthur himself. Interestingly, he's the only one without armour on. So here is the earliest depiction of King Arthur on his horse, holding a lance. Obviously, this is 12th, 13th century, so the knights of this era would carry a lance. And that's exactly what it says in Arthurian history as well. So here is King Arthur. And it's not in Britain, it's on a cathedral in Italy. So Arthurian legend, in many respects, is more about first century events in the Mediterranean basin. It's not about Britain. And this history was mainly spread around the Mediterranean basin, not in Britain. But you will say, no, this is not true, because the story mentions Wales. It mentions Wales on many occasions. It doesn't mention Europe. Well, no, I don't think so. What it actually mentions in the original Latin, if you read it in Latin, is it mentions Galles, which is a Gallic name for Wales. But the more famous Galles are the Galileans, the Galli priests of Cybele from Judea and Syria, who lived in the regions that we're talking about, Judea and Syria. We've talked about the Galli before. These were the Galli eunuch priests of Judea and Syria who dressed as women. Lucian says of the Galli, he says, on these days the Galli are made. When the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, a frenzy comes upon many. He throws off his clothes, takes up a sword and castrates himself. Then he rushes through the city, holding in his hands the parts he has cut off, and he takes female clothing and women's adornments from whatever house he throws his testicles into. So yes, these are the testicle tossers of the Near East. And we've already seen, I think before, certainly in the books, but I think also in one of the previous lectures, that Josephus Flavius also talks about these Galileans, these Galli, which he calls the Galileans. And that's a familiar term, isn't it? The Galileans. Anyway, Josephus calls them the Galileans. And he says of them, these Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments and were smeared with ointments that they might appear very comely. They had paints under their eyes and imitated not only the ornaments but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely dyed dresses, and ran everybody through whom they alighted upon. These were the Galli. So the Galli were effectively a sort of the martial equivalent of the Hijra eunuchs of India. These are the Hijra, and again they are dressed in women's clothing, just as Josephus said, but the only difference is that the Galileans concealed swords under their finely dyed dresses. But what, you might ask, what does all this have to do with Arthurian legend? Well, quite a lot, actually. Because the central figures in Arthurian legend, well, the central figures apart from King Arthur, and if you're looking at the Vulgate cycle, actually King Arthur is not actually a major character within Arthurian legend. The main characters were actually the Fisher Kings and the Wounded Kings. And the Wounded King was wounded in the thighs. And it's quite obvious when you read these texts that the Wounded King was a castrato eunuch. He was a Galli high priest who wore a dress. He was a Galilean. And likewise, Sir Galahad was also a Galli priest. That was his title. Because I say that Galahad was actually Percival. But he was given the title Galli or Galahad when he castrated himself, much as Arthurian legend actually says he does. And so he then became Percival Galahad, Percival the Galli high priest. And of course, remember a couple of things. Josephus Flavius says that the Galli wore dresses, whereas Arthurian history says that Galahad always wore red. So instead of wearing red armour, as is often implied, it's likely that Sir Galahad wore a red dress. And you might think that's unusual, that's a bit strange, that's not believable, but this is exactly what cardinals and bishops wear to this day. They wear a red dress. And so they are following on from the history and the traditions of Sir Percival Galahad. They wear the red dress of the Galli priests. And this is also the reason for the fabled Arthurian city of Sarras. I'm not sure if viewers will be familiar with Sarras, because I think it occurs more within the Vulgate cycle than in popular Arthurian history. But Sarras was one of the more famous cities. And I think it was called Sarras, because nobody knows where Sarras is, of course. It's called Sarras because in Aramaic it means eunuch. Sarras means eunuch. And so this was the city of the eunuchs. This is the city of the Galileans. And from the travelogue that's given in the Vulgate cycle, because it says they started off from Jerusalem and they went towards Babylon, I say that Sarras was Palmyra in the eastern desert of Syria, because that's en route to going towards Babylon. So this is the city that ISIS tried to destroy recently out in the eastern desert of Syria. It was the city of the eunuchs. And strangely enough, this mention of the galley eunuchs again dovetails in with biblical history. And you might again say, no, that's not possible. That's not what gospel story is about. It's nothing to do with galley high priests. It's nothing to do with eunuchs. But Jesus was also a Galilean. He was a galley priest, as it says in Luke 23:6. And Peter was also a Galilean in Mark 14:70, which would suggest that both Peter and Jesus were castrated at some time. And again, you'll say that's not possible. That's not what the gospel story is all about. It's impossible, but it's not. This is just another of these parts of gospel history that you've never been taught about because it was too embarrassing, and so it's not taught in church, it's not taught in Sunday school, it's not taught anywhere. But Jesus did ask for his disciples to become eunuchs. Jesus said, some eunuchs were born from their mother's womb, and some eunuchs were made eunuchs by men. And there are also eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So the advice from Jesus is clear. If you are able to become a galley priest, then you should. And you should castrate yourself. And Peter, I believe, did just that. I think Peter is the character who became the galley priest. Peter is sort of like the Percival character from Arthurian history, who also became a galley high priest. And this might be the reason for if you remember in gospel history, the semi-naked youth that fled from the Mount of Olives in Mark 14:51. This is probably what was happening there. People have always wondered, why is this semi-naked youth fleeing from the Mount of Olives? Well, it was probably a ceremony to initiate and make the next galley high priest. And to become a galley high priest, you had to be castrated. So the mention of the galleys, which everyone says refers to Wales, this proves that this is a Welsh story, a Celtic story, has brought us straight back to the 1st century Near East, to the gospel stories. So you might ask yourself, is anything in Arthurian legend connected with Britain? Well, surely the tradition of the Round Table is uniquely British, isn't it? We have one hanging in one of the buildings next door to Winchester Abbey. Anyway, the Winchester Round Table. Surely the Round Table is uniquely British. Unfortunately, not. According to Merlin Grail, we've already looked at Merlin Grail, but according to Merlin Grail, there were 3 round tables. The first of these tables was the round table of Jesus and his 12 disciples. This was the Last Supper table. So the Last Supper table was not rectangular like Leonardo has drawn it. The Last Supper table was round. and the 12 disciples sat around the round table. The second of these round tables was the round table of Joseph of Arimathea and his 24 disciples, because Joseph of Arimathea was so much better than Jesus, so he had 24 disciples instead of 12. And the third round table was the round table of King Arthur and his 12 knights. And here's a sort of depiction of it. So even the Arthurian round table was based upon the gospel narrative. Because remember that all of the disciples were armed. The Gospels say so. So the gospel disciples were as much knights as the knights of the round table. And furthermore, the round table was not simply a piece of furniture. It was astrological. It was a zodiac. The big secret of Judaism is that their primary symbol was actually the zodiac. And this is especially so of Nazarene Judaism. One of the best of these is located at Hamat Tavera on the Sea of Galilee. And viewers should take a look at my talk on ancient astrology, where I go into this zodiac in much more detail. Anyway, I demonstrate that this zodiac was built by the biblical Jesus, because this is what Josephus Flavius says. Josephus says he was sent to find and destroy the images of animals that lay 4 furlongs to the south of Tiberias. And if you go to Tiberias and walk for 4 furlongs to the south, you will find this zodiac and its images of animals. Which is interesting because it strongly implies that this zodiac is actually 1st century, and it was owned by the biblical Jesus, because in the works of Josephus, the person who owned this zodiac was Jesus of Gamala. So this zodiac was the template for all of the round tables, the subsequent round tables. And so now we know why there were 12 disciples or 12 knights around the table, because each of the disciples or knights represented a constellation. And again, remember that Jesus' disciples were armed, so the biblical disciples were also knights of the round Last Supper table. And we also know that the traditional layout of this table is wrong. This is the Winchester round table. And you can see here that the central character is the Arthur character, who's actually here depicted as Henry VIII, is sitting at the head of the table. Now, this is actually wrong. The Jesus or Arthur character did not sit at the head of the round table. They sat in the center, so because this was a zodiac. So the table would have actually looked something like this. It was a ring with a hole in the center for the Jesus Arthur character to sit, because Jesus and Arthur were incarnations of Ra, Aton, Helios, the sun god, and the sun god sat at the center of the zodiac, as we've seen on this zodiac before. Now we can see a reason for Arthur being called Arthur, because the zodiac at Hamat is a fairly traditional depiction with the sun in the center. So we're sort of in the cosmos looking down upon the solar system, and we can see the sun and the earth surrounded by the 12 constellations. But if we're on the earth and we look upwards towards the northern constellations, it's the northern constellations that are in the center of the zodiac. And so the center of the zodiac, the center of the round table, becomes Ursa Major, the Great Bear, as we can see in this zodiac here. And it is from the Great Bear that the name for Arthur was derived. So now we know why King Arthur was called by that name. He was the center of the zodiac, just as Jesus was the center of the zodiac. And so he was the Arthur He was the Great Bear. And so we also know that the primary veneration of Arthurian legend was astrology and the zodiac. And this explains the birth of King Arthur. The birth of King Arthur is very loosely based upon the birth of Hercules. It's more or less the same story. But Monmouth takes this one step further. And Geoffrey of Monmouth says of the birth of King Arthur, he says, there appeared a star of marvellous size and brightness, in the likeness of a dragon, and from the mouth of the dragon issued forth two rays, reaching beyond the regions of Gaul and the Irish Sea. The ray towards Gaul portended that a son shall be born, while the other ray signified a daughter. The son and the daughter being prophesied here were Arthur and Guinevere, of course. But what does this two-ray symbolism mean? Was this the two rays of a comet, as is often claimed? Possibly, but there is a much better explanation. And to see this, we need to look at some early Welsh manuscripts, because they are interesting. Because we all know that King Arthur was the son of Uther Pendragon. Because that's what we've been told. We've been told that in popular mythology and in academic research. King Arthur was the son of Uther Pendragon. But was he? Actually, the manuscripts do not say Pendragon at all. What they actually say is Uther Bendragon. You can see it here on this manuscript. And here's another manuscript. This one, you can see the Ben as the last word on the top line is Ben, and then the first word of the next line down is dragon. Uther Bendragon. It's funny how things we know for certain ain't necessarily so. We all know that the father of King Arthur was called Pendragon, but he wasn't. And even after mentioning this to academia, they simply say, oh, it was a spelling mistake. I don't think it was. So if this is not a mistake, and of course this happens in many manuscripts, it's not just a single manuscript that says Bandragon, what does this mean? Well, academia has tried to translate the Ben from the Welsh because they think this is a Celtic story. But I think that this is actually Aramaic. Why? Well, because we've been talking about Joseph of Arimathea and various gospel events and people and religions that existed in Judea. And because one of the big influences on the Welsh language, even if this was written later in Welsh, was the Bible. And the original Bible, of course, was Aramaic. So I think the name Bendragon is likely to be Aramaic. And in Aramaic, it means the son of Dagon, the son of a fish. Or since we've been talking about zodiacs, the son of Pisces. Son of Pisces. Okay, so now we know what these two rays are. They are not two rays of a comet. They are the two rays of the constellation of Pisces. So take a look at this image of the constellation of Pisces. It has two rays, exactly as the manuscript by Monmouth and Oxford says. And this symbolism is not a recent invention, because the Dendera zodiac from Egypt shows exactly the same two rays. And the Dendera zodiac is some 2,000 years old. Furthermore, these two rays end in circles, depicting Helios and Selene, the sun and the moon. A princely son and a princess daughter, exactly as claimed in Monmouth's manuscript. In fact, it's almost as if Geoffrey of Monmouth is looking at and describing the Dendera zodiac. He says, from the mouth of the dragon, that's the fish, Pisces, issued forth two rays. One ray predicted that a son will be born, and the other ray signified a daughter. Helios and Selene, the son and the daughter, Arthur and Guinevere. And of course, the Dagon, the dragon, is the constellation of Pisces. Okay, so do we have enough information now to identify King Arthur in the historical record? And do bear in mind that my Grail cipher contains 600 pages of evidence. It's not just what we've been through here. There is an awful lot of evidence pointing in this direction. So who was the real King Arthur? Well, he was a king who was battling against the Romans, who venerated the zodiac. He had a table, a round table, with 12 disciple knights. He had a sister wife who was identified with Selene and with Venus. He was closely linked to the galley eunuchs, the wounded kings. He was a Galilean. He was closely linked to fishermen, the fisher kings, the kings of Pisces. He had knights who lived in Mesopotamia and worked for King Agbarus of Edessa. The unpalatable truth that many will not accept, and that's both Arthurian purists who believe in a historical Arthur and Arthurian skeptics who say the story is completely mythological. The unpalatable truth that will not be accepted is that King Arthur is a pseudonym for the biblical King Jesus. Think about that for a minute. What happened is that the true story of Jesus had been lost. As I narrated in my Jesus King of Edessa book, Josephus Flavius had done his best to destroy this history. But vague legends remained, especially in places like Edessa, which was so closely connected to the Jesus story. And the Crusades in the late 11th, early 12th century presented an opportunity to rediscover this history. And the leader of the First Crusade in 1096 was Count Baldwin of Boulogne. And he marched his army all the way across Anatolia. But on reaching Antioch, on the corner of the Mediterranean there, instead of turning right down towards Jerusalem, he carried straight on into Mesopotamia. But what was he doing? He was supposed to be liberating Jerusalem from the Saracens. So what was Count Baldwin doing, marching beyond the Euphrates? The answer is that the first city to be liberated during the Crusades was Edessa. And if you want to know the reason why, you'll need to read my Jesus King of Edessa book, where Jesus is identified as a real warrior monarch from Edessa. So Jesus King of Edessa is a gospel jigsaw puzzle in which all of the pieces fit together perfectly. And the interesting thing is that Arthurian history is now saying very much the same sort of thing. Again, it's backing up my previous research and confirming what I said in these previous books. So, back in the 11th century, in Edessa, it's quite obvious that the Crusaders had discovered manuscripts detailing the true life of Jesus, the true life as is given in my book, Jesus King of Edessa, that Jesus was a real king and a real warrior monarch who battled with Rome. But this history was heretical, so what could they do with it? The answer? They gave it to Monmouth and Oxford, who crafted a mythological history about a semi-mythical King Arthur, a character who was firmly based upon the true history of King Jesus. Because that story was heretical, it was dangerous, but nobody could be burned at the stake for writing a mythology of Britain. And that is why we ended up with Arthurian legend. This was the secret that the Knights Templar held. This is the secret that the Catholic Church feared. This is the secret that Jacques de Molay held while being slow roasted by the Catholic Church. And yet the truth about the life of King Jesus was there all the time, hidden in plain sight within Arthurian legend, that he was a warrior monarch fighting against the Romans. There are so many allusions to this being true within Arthurian legend, and you can discover them all within my Grail cipher. But here's just a small example. King Ban and King Bors were Arthurian kings. You might not have heard of them, but within the Vulgate cycle, they are quite famous kings. They were the fathers of Bors and Lionel and Lancelot and Hector. So they're quite central to Arthurian legend. Anyway, Ban and Bors were in a conflict against King Claudas, a king who controlled much of the Roman Empire and was invading their lands. And we have a description of Claudas, who is said to have been a great bull of a man, of intimidating size, with a handsome chest and a broad face. He has a short and twisted nose, widely spaced eyes, reddish hair, and a thick neck. But is this not a perfect description of Vespasian and of his son Titus? A great bull of a man, of intimidating size, with a broad face, widely spaced eyes, and a thick neck. This is what Arthurian legend was all about. And it so happens that Vespasian not only invaded Britain under Emperor Claudius, from which this name was derived, he also invaded Judea during the Jewish revolt. So he was involved in both of these regions in the 1st century. Undoubtedly, Arthurian legend is actually giving us an account of the Jewish revolt against Rome, which was led by the biblical King Jesus of Edessa, who fought against Roman commanders Vespasian and Titus. But nobody in the 12th century could admit that. Having discovered, this history in the catacombs under Edessa somewhere, nobody in the 12th century could admit that, because it was a Christian heresy worthy of a slow roasting. And after the Knights Templar were destroyed in 1307, most of this knowledge was lost. It's only now being rediscovered in my Grail cipher. So before we finish this lecture, where do we think that King Arthur Jesus was actually buried? Intriguingly, Geoffrey of Monmouth says that Merlin built a mausoleum for Uther Pendragon, that's Uther Ben-Dragoon, the father of Arthur Jesus. And that mausoleum was called Stonehenge. Now, this has been considered pure mythology because nothing in Arthurian legend could be found within real history. But now we know that much of Arthurian legend is true, and I've already traced the history of Jesus coming to Britain, to England. Was King Jesus Arthur also buried at Stonehenge? I hope you've enjoyed this long video on Arthurian history and can join us again next time in these illumination lectures. And because it seems so appropriate, I leave you again with the hymn Jerusalem by William Blake, which does happen to mention England rather than Britain. Thank you.